Good evening. I'm Felix Stain, co-director of the Ideas Network 2030, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the organizers. Our event is a natural follow-up of last year's event, where we also discussed with David McAllister, and we discussed the geopolitics and China. And this year we wanted to focus on Russia and the security architecture of Europe. And tragically, this has become far more timely than any of us intended. Russia's invasion of Ukraine marks one of those moments in time where systematic shifts occur and where history is being made. And the West has rallied together, and in the face of the horror we see daily from Ukraine, this is at least marks some sort of slender silver lining. Today, the EU foreign and defense ministers are meeting in Brussels, and although the UK is no longer part of the EU, the recent sanctions and activities of Western states have, despite recent rather clumsy comments, shown the EU and UK to be united. The key question, of course, is where do we go from here? And I look forward to hearing from our esteemed speakers on those matters. This event is organized in cooperation with the Conservative European Forum, and I'm very thankful to Amber Rudd to chair this session. And if you would like today's debate or would like to see past recordings, please go to our website, www.ideasnetwork.2030.com, ideasnetwork2030.com, and sign up for future events so you will never miss any fascinating discussion. Before handing over to Amber, please be reminded that this session is being recorded and that the Chatham House rule does not apply. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you're given the floor to ask a question or comment. And finally, a very special thank you to you both, David and Tobias, for making time despite your very hectic schedules these days. And now, Amber, over to you.
Thank you so much, Felix. And it's a great pleasure to be here to be able to chair this event with you, Felix, and to welcome so many participants to this event. I can't imagine many more important subjects right at the moment. You know, we've all been watching in horror as Russia has invaded Ukraine and the daily consequences of that. And we must also, apart from feeling huge sympathy and support for the Ukrainians, we're thinking, what does this mean for the West? What does this mean for Europe? And we've got two great speakers who are going to kindly share with us their views. And then we're going to have some questions and perhaps a sort of discussion about what else can be done, what should be done, and what other significant points we'd like to raise. The purpose of this group is to reinforce the need for cooperation across Europe. And these events of the past few weeks, as Felix has just said, has shown how Europe can work well together and how that shared history and boundary is so important to our security. So I'm now going to introduce you to our two speakers. We're going to hear from David McAllister, who I've just met this evening, who holds both German and British citizenship. So it'll be very interesting to hear his perspective. And he personifies the bonds really across this continent. He's been a member of the European Parliament since 2014 and is currently the Vice President of the EPP, the European People's Party, which some of us remember nostalgically, and is chair of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee and a member of the EU-UK Parliamentary Friendship Assembly. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. I really look forward to hearing from you. And we're also going to be joined by Tobias Ellwood, hot off just giving his views on the PM programme this afternoon. He is a British Member of Parliament and a Lieutenant Colonel and as a reservist in the British Army's 77th Brigade. He was a Conservative Minister at the MOD from 2007 to 19 and was member of the parliamentary delegation to the NATO Assembly and parliamentary advisor to the Prime Minister in 2014. But most importantly, really, for our from hearing from him today, he's chair of the Defence Select Committee and does a fantastic job continually raising the issue of chair and making sure the right questions are made and challenged, and giving him, for which many of us are very grateful, a really important platform to raise important international and relevant issues. So thank you both for joining us. I'm going to invite Tobias, first of all, to make some opening remarks, and then we'll hear from David, and then we'll have some questions. Thank you so much. So over to you, Tobias.
Well, Amber, thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to join you this evening, and I'm really pleased to be able to share some thoughts with our European counterparts, because ultimately it is about greater European unity that we're going to be able to challenge some of the issues that we're facing here today. And can I just say, personally, really pleased to see David. You and I cross paths every so often. Croatia, I think, was the last time. Great to be sharing a platform with you once again. Lots of people described what we're going through now as a tipping point, a moment in history, and I wouldn't disagree with that. The deeper question is what we're actually going to do about it. I have every confidence that the Europe that emerges from this crisis will be far more committed to defending democracy, will probably see return to Cold War levels of defense spend, and no doubt will see us, perhaps with a bit more resolute determination, be able to stand up to countries such as Russia, even though they may pose nuclear weapons, without thinking that things are going to ratchet out of control. But right now, we're not there. And right now, we are far too timid in expressing our strengths, in providing our support for Ukraine. We're providing the goodies for them to take on the fight against Russia, but we're really leaving them to it. We're distancing ourselves from any rather wider responsibility of taking on Russia. And if I can put it rather dramatically, and I don't wish to dismiss the destruction, the mayhem, the genocide, the war crimes that are taking place in Ukraine, but this is a mere skirmish from what could potentially lay ahead. And how we conduct ourselves over the next few weeks, months, and indeed next couple of years, in my view, will actually determine how our next few decades play out. I grew up in Vienna, in Austria. My father worked at the United Nations, and in the 80s, I remember the Cold War. I remember the Iron Curtain was very much not far from Vienna, going to Czechoslovakia or Hungary at the time, when we crossed into the border there. And the feeling that there was this superpower that had a different ideological perspective on the world, and that we had to be prepared for the unthinkable. There were bridges in Vienna which had those big iron girders underneath them, and I remember asking my father, "What are those for?" And that, imagine, is in case the Soviets actually chose to somehow advance, to the West. We've had 30 years of luxury. We've had 30 years of peace. We've had 30 years where we have now come to enjoy a different form of life. And unfortunately, this, we need to recognize, is unusual. The world is now resorting to type, where there are state-on-state aggressors, and we have to actually work much harder to defend our international rules-based order. And what we're seeing right now, and this is why it's so critical for us to wake up and recognize the pace in which things are changing, is the fact that we're seeing an ideological, geopolitical splinter take place across our world. For it isn't, as I say, just Russia itself we should pay attention to, but it's the conduct of China that sits behind Russia. China has not condemned the invasion that's taken place. I think it actually, my view is that it actually quite enjoys Putin doing the front of house things, annoying the West, keeping us busy, keeping us distracted from otherwise paying attention to what China is up to. And I think China is very committed. They think in terms of decades. They are much more strategic in their thought, long term, compared with us, which tend to think in election cycles. Perhaps Putin can be dispensed with, but ultimately that bond with Russia will be critical. They both share a dislike for the West. They both have a disdain for the ability of America to dominate our international rules-based order, and they want to be able to exploit the perhaps ineffectiveness of our weak international institutions for their own benefit. And I'm afraid, whilst many of us have predicted this for some time, it is now happening today. It is now happening in front of us. And it's the hesitance of the United States which perhaps concerns me the most, but provides an opportunity for us in Europe to look at the theatre of operations on the continent, and particularly to ask ourselves what more we can do. I really welcome and encourage the direction of travel of Germany to move so swiftly, $100 billion or euros or whatever it is, investment in your armed forces. What a change that is to then recognize that you need to take a much more proactive involvement in European security. It's going to require some adult conversations to get through some of these issues. The comments by the Prime Minister this weekend on Brexit, which I responded to and criticized, we need to move beyond that, because ultimately it is this disunity, this discord across Europe that Russia has been able to exploit. My concern at the moment is that the sanctions that we have in place, whilst they will ultimately lead to the demise and an eventual removal of Putin, because there is no return for Russia to the international stage, there is no return for its economy to strengthen with him in charge, he can do a huge amount of damage in Ukraine and beyond before eventually somehow he's removed. And at the moment, we have NATO sitting on the doorstep of Ukraine, feeding in munitions and so forth, but leaving Ukraine to do all the heavy lifting. And we need to find our previous Cold War levels of statecraft skills to start to stand up, recognize those threats, place them in perspective, and allow ourselves to provide solutions which are proportional, but allow us to control the escalatory ladder without things spiraling out of control. And this is the big question for us to recognize, that America may not be there to the extent that we would want. As leaders of the Western world, we need to start looking at providing our own solutions to security, to diplomacy, to democracy, to defending democracy in Europe, as we embark on what I believe will be a very, very testing decade indeed. I think I'll pause there for the moment, if I may, Amber. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tobias. You've given us a lot to think about, and I've got a few questions myself. But before we do that, can I just urge anybody who would like to say anything or ask some questions, that we have the chat function at the bottom, which you'll all be familiar with by now. Do put your questions in there, or just raise your hand in the usual way with the button, and I'll come to you later. So David, particularly interested to hear from you about Tobias's comments about Germany as well. Over to you. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me, and warm greetings here from Brussels in the European Parliament. I can underline so many things Tobias just mentioned. I would agree with his analysis. Tobias was just telling us about his childhood in Vienna. Well, I am not only a kid of the British military presence in Germany, I actually was born and grew up in West Berlin, which was probably the coldest spot of all coldest spots during the Cold War. West Berlin being an island surrounded by communism, surrounded by Soviet and East German forces. And the security guarantee for West Berlin was the presence of the three allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. And if there had been a fully fledged attack on Berlin, the Allies wouldn't have been able to defend the city for long, perhaps a week or so. But it was psychologically so important for West Berliners. And that's why West Berliners will never forget what solidarity the United States, France, and Britain showed until 1989, when finally the wall came down. War has returned to Europe. I have two daughters, 15 and 17. They had such a wonderful childhood. They knew nothing about what it means that there can be a war in Europe. Ukraine is a neighboring country of the European Union. Lemberg is closer to Berlin than Rome. This shows people in Germany actually how close this war is. This is not a war between the largest country in Europe and, when it comes to size, the second largest war, but this is a war against our European values, everything what is important for us. And that's why I believe that this is a moment of truth for Europe. It's a moment of truth for the whole Western world, because in the end, this war is a clash between the rule of law and the rule of the gun. It's a clash between a democracy and an autocracy. It's a clash between a rules-based order on the one hand and a world of naked aggression on the other hand. That's why there's so much more at stake here. I believe that the West has shown remarkable unity. Hardly ever has there been such close transatlantic cooperation between the European Union, the 27, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, South Korea, and others. This war has brought us back together, and I do hope that this new momentum in transatlantic cooperation, but also in cooperation between the EU27 and the United Kingdom, that we can keep some of this new momentum after this war hopefully will come to an end soon. When you organized this event, who would have thought that we would be discussing this not only these difficult times, but actually on this Monday evening of the 21st of March, because in this town today is a special day. The foreign affairs ministers and the defense ministers of the EU are in Brussels, and today the Foreign Ministers' Council has formally approved the strategic compass at a time when we witness the return of war in Europe. Now, what is the strategic compass about? You will be probably reading about this also in tomorrow's newspapers in Britain. In the end, the strategic compass, which was initiated under the German EU presidency of the Council in 2020 and then taken further, is more or less an ambitious plan of action, how to strengthen the EU security and defense policy by 2030. Josep Borrell, the High Representative, as we call him, Foreign Minister of the European Union, spoke today about a quantum leap forward. Well, one thing is clear, this strategic compass is for me a kind of a white book, how we can improve our own security and defense in Europe. And things will change, things have to change. We are now seeing that European countries are starting to get very serious on security and defense. We're talking about the open debate in Finland and Sweden to join NATO, especially in the Finnish election campaign, which is upcoming. I believe that the question of Finnish NATO membership will probably one of the key, if not the key, campaign argument for Kokoomus, our sister party in Finland. Denmark will hold a referendum whether Denmark should now join the common security and defense policy, which it has always been very reluctant to join. And Tobias mentioned Germany. Yes, Germany is doing remarkable steps. It actually took the outbreak of a war until Germany was finally ready to get serious on security and defense. I remember our election campaign in September last year very well. It didn't work out well for us in the end, but we, the Christian Democrats, were arguing in favor of the 2% target in Germany, and we were harshly criticized by our socialist and green competitors, accusing us of sable rattling and being the puppets of the Americans and all these arguments. And now the German Chancellor has announced that Germany wants to spend at least 2%. We will check if these are just empty promises, because this means in the end for Germany, instead of spending 50 billion euros a year on security and defense, we need to spend 70 billion euros every year to match the 2% target. So that's 20% every year what we have to spend more than we have spent in recent years. And Tobias, you mentioned the 100 billion euros special investment fund. 20 billion euros times 5 is 100 billion. So these 100 billion will only guarantee actually for 5 years that we can match the NATO spending target. So we have to get very serious in Germany on security and defense like other countries. A final point I want to make, I am very much in favor of closer cooperation in the European Union on security and defense. And with the permanent structured cooperation, with the European Defence Fund, with the European Defence Agency, with the annual review of our defence and security activities, a framework has been set. Probably a framework which has been set in recent years. After in 2016, the UK government said, look, we're about to leave the European Union, we will now give up our resistance. But whatever we do on more activities on our common defense and security policy, it should never be against NATO, it should never be in competition with NATO, it should never be simply duplicating NATO capabilities. It's about giving real added value. NATO is the backbone of our European security. We are dependent on a close cooperation with NATO allies like the United States, Canada, or the United Kingdom. It's about strengthening the European pillar within NATO, and it's about identifying fields where we as a European Union can add value for a real stronger European security and defense policy in the next decade. Or as our former Defense Secretary Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer said, we want to remain transatlantic, we want to stay transatlantic, but we want to become a bit more European on security and defense. This is what the strategic compass is about, which will be heavily discussed in the next few days, and it's been now formally approved by the foreign ministers, but it still needs to be endorsed at the end of the week when the 27 heads of government and state of the EU meet in Brussels. So I'll keep it there. A final point, because I'm talking to a British audience. I believe that the trade and cooperation agreement between the European Union and the UK is a good, solid legal basis for our future cooperation. It's a pity that it was not possible to negotiate a chapter on a structured, formalized cooperation on foreign affairs, security, and defense. I believe this would still be better for both sides. Perhaps the events of the last 3 or 4 weeks have also shown some people in London that there might be some arguments to have some kind of formalized cooperation between the United Kingdom and the European Union. For the first time since Brexit, the Foreign Minister was invited, the Foreign Secretary was invited to attend the European Foreign Ministers' Council a couple of weeks ago. This all shows there is willingness and readiness on our side in the EU to have closer links with the United Kingdom, also on the important fields of foreign affairs, security, and defense. And we all know, especially in Germany, that whatever happens, the United Kingdom will never be a simple third country for us, but a partner in G7, G20, the United Nations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and especially a rock-solid NATO ally.
Thank you very much, David, and particularly for giving us such a current update on what the thinking is now in the EU, and for telling us about the raising of money for defence, not just from Germany, but from other countries, and other countries wanting to join the EU and the defence and security arrangements as well. We've got a number of questions. I'm going to call on Nacho and then Nicholas afterwards. But first of all, could I just take the opportunity to ask Tobias? Tobias, you've been calling for a sort of basically a stronger response, and there's been quite a lot recently in the airwaves about people saying, are we right to continue to say, well done, Ukraine, you carry on while we sit back, except giving them lethal weapons, but still it's like we're all encouraging them to stand firm, and while we go to bed quietly and easily in our own beds at night. What do you have a concern about that? I think I just want to ask you to set that out, and also, well, what is it you think we should do? Because it's also a fact that Russia has 10 times as many lethal nuclear weapons as NATO does, and so there is a real concern about any sort of escalation.
This is the critical question that I think is dominating the White House right now. But we are still, I think, exhibiting a peacetime construct in our decision making, and we need to be more robust, show more fortitude, more grasp of the situation to be able to make incremental decisions to stand up proportionately to what we see happening at play on the ground, without immediately assuming and almost panicking that every decision we make is going to lead to nuclear war. And you touched on it yourself. We even get to the point where President Biden actually declares, I don't want to start World War III. That's actually showing our timidity. It's showing how risk averse we've become. It's actually encouraging Putin to exploit and explore how far he can actually push things on his side. Now, it could be on no-fly zone, which has almost become totemic, if you like, on Western, greater Western intervention. I actually don't disagree that perhaps needs to be considered very hard, in detail, and perhaps dismissed. But you don't declare to your opposition what you're not going to do. We spent more time telling Putin what we refuse to do rather than saying what we might do. And I spoke to the defense minister today for Ukraine. I met him very briefly, who was in town. And it's clear that the direct trajectory of events right now is actually not going in Ukraine's favor, simply because the munitions are not going in. We're still hesitating about whether to send in defensive or offensive weapon systems. Now, their initial invasion tactics failed supremely. They thought they were going to liberate the country. We knew that. But they're now bombing from afar. And they have weapon systems which they can do this. They want to destroy cities, send refugees out of the country, meaning what's left in Ukraine is actually easier to control. A city which is 1/8 the size of what it was is far easier as a dominating force to control than one that is fully intact with a working class and then a vibrant insurgency that's then going to have a pop at you. And so we are seeing an entire country destroyed before our eyes. And the growing population is saying, why are we stepping back? Why are we not doing more? So I've no doubt about it that there is a higher risk involved here. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. But at the moment, we're showing such timidity. It's being exploited by the other side.
Okay, thanks very much, Tobias. And Nacho, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amber. Just to start, I wanted to comment that I think Felix was quite generous talking about clumsy wording from the Prime Minister this weekend in his comparison of the Brexit vote and the situation in Ukraine. I'm not sure that's out of clumsiness or he knew exactly what he was saying and what it says about his fitness to be Prime Minister. Even if it's out of clumsiness, it says a lot about his fitness to be Prime Minister. Anyway, the thing, one thing that I want to comment is, okay, in order to put a stop to the Putin regime, we need to start at home. The thing is that London is full of bankers, brokers, lobbyists, lawyers, accountants, even like public schools and universities, who take a lot of money out of people that are either Putin cronies or associates, or they had some links to all this kleptocracy. The thing is that, okay, when is the government going to act against this collaborationism? The thing is that these are people that have made a lot of money, frankly, because more honest people were not willing to take this business. And the thing is that they have been directly beneficiary from a regime that threatened us with weapons of mass destruction and which murders people in UK soil.
Is your question, why isn't the government doing more against oligarchs? Do you want to just
I think what is the government doing in order to target not just the oligarchs that is now targeting after giving plenty of notice, by the way, but what is doing with the collaborationists that have been enabling these oligarchs and these people linked to the Putin regime for so long. And finally, the thing is that I think as conservatives, we should take stock and wonder why ourselves, why our party is in the news every week with this or is this other individual that maybe rightly or wrongly, they are linked to they are talked about to having these links, and we can say about donors, we can say about people that had made business.
I'm going to stop you if I may, Nacho. I think I've got the point. I'm going to pass it on to Tobias, but before I do that, if I may, having been Home Secretary at the time when some of this was sort of taking place, I have to say that the UK was very much, and I hope that David will back this up, it was usually the UK who was leaning heavily on the EU to get more sanctions in place. David Cameron was very clear about that when he was in government, and we were warning that Putin was a real danger. And when we had the Skripal, for instance, poisoning on the streets of London, and the Foreign Secretary, now the Prime Minister, did pretty well, hopefully supported by the rest of the government, in trying to get a strong response, not just from America, but from the rest of the EU. And some European countries were a little reluctant, and they preferred their more successful friendship with the Russians than standing up to Putin. So just to point that out, rather than think that London has always been the center of some trouble, it's been difficult over the past few years to point out to our European friends, particularly individual countries, the danger of being too close to Russia. So back over to Tobias now.
Yeah, I very quickly, I can answer this. Yeah, we need to absolutely do more. If you are going to harm Putin, then you need to be able to get to the money that was stolen from the Russian people. A lot of that came through London. We were slow in providing the necessary legislation. Tom Tugendhat, who is chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, looked at this 4 years ago, did a great job in putting forward recommendations. They're now being taken up. And if we want to absolutely make sure that there is no area whereby Russian money can move in shell companies, in providing spending money and investment in the UK, then we need to act and act swiftly. So there's absolutely an appetite, if there wasn't before, to make sure that the legislation is now put in place.
Thanks very much. Nicholas, over to you for your question, and then we'll hear from Robert.
So, Tobias, I completely agree with you on the need to be bolder. And I wanted to ask a question on how we can have the right sources of legitimacy, because we can't go through the UN if we have the Russian and maybe the Chinese veto. Equally, if we go purely wearing the mantle of NATO, it may seem too threatening, too much the first steps towards World War III. But surely some alternative, like coalitions of the willing, could be a way forward. And what about international brigades? What about the possibility of establishing and maintaining a safety zone over Lviv, which in military terms should be reasonably feasible? What do you have in mind in specific terms, and how do we justify it?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your question, and I don't disagree at all. We're not exploring this at all. You mentioned the United Nations Security Council, and of course the veto is there, and that begs bigger questions as to how a critical organization can be repaired for the next 50, 100 years, because clearly it's questionably fit for purpose now. What does work still is the UN General Assembly, which is everybody gets a vote. And there were times in the past where they passed legislation. They could provide safe haven areas over Ukraine right now. You could easily put safe haven areas over the nuclear power stations, legitimately calling for the fact that these should be isolated from the war because of the grave consequences of one of these plants blowing up. And look where the plume of winds, the prevailing winds, would take the fallout. You could pass that now, and that wouldn't require people offering to lean in and police it. It could simply be there as an international law, which, if breached, further goes against Putin himself to hold him up against war crimes. But also it will test China. And I make this point because as long as China is backing Putin and Russia itself, this all becomes very, very difficult. And then we can't be in denial that that is now the wider challenge, the bigger strategic challenge that we need to face. But certainly on a on a lower level, operational level, we could provide greater weapon systems, more sophisticated. Again, I spoke to the defense minister about this. More sophisticated anti-air systems, the Rapier system, for example. There are 60 MiG aircraft in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Poland that could be slid across to the Ukrainian Air Force today, if we wished, being blocked by one person, and that's President Biden. A political judgment being made, again, for fear that things will ratchet out of control. And we need to ask ourselves whether it's now we here on the continent need to take advantage of that. And I'll stick my neck out here. I think there is scope for the three nations, France, Britain, and Germany, as we did in the past, quietly, to lean in, to lead the way as to where European security should go, as to where the ideas are. We need almost like a Casablanca type conference. Work out what we want to do, let alone what the threats are and what they're coming, but how we actually work together. I'm afraid that the construct that we have, the complicated overlapping but not quite overlapping of the EU and NATO means that it is difficult to get unity across Europe. But if we're ever going to do it, now is the time to achieve that. And Germany's change, there is an opportunity for Britain and Germany to then move forward. And I think France would have to then sort of join in with that as well. Difficult diplomatic back channels, to work there. But ultimately, these are the conversations I would like to think would be happening behind the scenes now. I fear they're not, though.
Thank you, Tobias. David, I'm going to come to you. What do you think of Tobias's bold suggestion, particularly given that France has the presidency of the EU? Is it wishful thinking, France, Germany, UK? What do you think?
Look, I don't want to bother you with domestic German politics, but just bear one thing in mind. You are now getting to know Olaf Scholz, who in the German Socialist Party is a reasonably sensible and moderate man. And our foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, is also in the Green Party, a moderate and sensible woman. But both parties have very strong left wings, and this government will spend a lot of time convincing the socialist and the Green backbench what this actually means. I mean, what has happened in Germany in the past few weeks is totally incredible. If somebody had told me 3 months ago that a socialist German chancellor would announce 100 billion euros extra investment fund, 2% target every year, NATO target, and many other things, it would have been unheard of. So the debates are less between the moderates and the government and the CDU-CSU in Germany. It will be more about the internal debates. But that's all I wanted to say on domestic German politics. So we will have to wait and see if this new approach is actually sustainable or if this is just a short-term reaction. The second remark I wanted to make is that just like Tobias, I had the opportunity of speaking to the Ukrainian defense minister last week. He was a guest in our Foreign Affairs Committee meeting in the European Parliament, connected per video from Kiev. And he had 3 messages. Thank you, European Union. Thank you, West, what you have done and what you are continuing to do. And then there are 3 points where we need more. Sanctions, 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 no-fly zone, and more weapons. And when it comes to sanctions, the European Union and our partners, including the UK, we have already imposed massive sanctions on Russia, unprecedented in scope. And I believe that these sanctions will be effective. Is there room for, or is there a necessity for a 5th sanctions package? I think we will see in the next few days. And this will once again need to be closely coordinated between Washington, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, London, Ottawa, and others. In the end, sanctions, I believe it's important that we target the Russian leaders, the elites, the strategic sectors of the Kremlin-run economy, and that our aim shouldn't be to harm the Russian people, but to weaken the Kremlin's ability to finance this outrageous war. On European defense, well, of course, there are actually 2 major military powers in Europe, Western Europe. That's the United Kingdom and France. Germany has always played a different role for obvious reasons, and I believe that Germany will continue to be perhaps a bit more cautious than others. This is deeply rooted in our mindset, but the time has now come that Germany understands that we cannot continue pretending to be a big Switzerland. We will have to shoulder more responsibility, and we will have to spend more on defense, but we will not only have to spend more on defense, we will also then have to prove that we are ready to shoulder more responsibility alongside our allies. And of course, France, the UK, and Germany, these are the 3 leading forces. And the difference simply is that France and the UK, of course, are nuclear powers, so they are playing in a different league than Germany. Something which will need to be balanced is, on the one hand, the cooperation of the 3, London, Paris, Berlin, perhaps preferred by some folks in London, and on the other hand, Germany, which is always keen to have a foreign and security and defense policy within the framework of the EU27, and then add other third countries to our cooperation. So we need to find some kind of structure and format there. And a final point, what Tobias was talking about. We will have to come up with new ideas how we can cooperate in Europe as long as the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is around, because not only has Russia invaded Ukraine and started a war of aggression, Russia has violated the whole European peace and security architecture, which was built up since 1945. And even the coldest hours of the Cold War, we had a structure like the Conference on the Security and Cooperation in Europe, and now the OSCE. So, I mean, institutions like the Council of Europe, the OSCE, they have all now been destroyed in their form. They have been functioning for the last years and decades because simply Russia is behaving like an outlaw. And this will pose enormous challenges. How are we going to deal with such an aggressive Russia, which obviously no longer will stick to any kind of rules which we had agreed upon over many years and decades?
Thank you, David. Yes, a reminder there at the end that everything has changed and we're dealing with the immediate now, but there's going to be a lot of realignment taking place over the next few years. So I just want to get through a few more questions, if I may. I'm going to ask Robert Morland to ask his question. I think we've addressed John Knight's question, but so I'm going to come after that to Sajjad Karim's question about China. Thank you, Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much for that. Could I say in introduction, I actually appreciated your point, Amber, at the very beginning about the role of the UK, because actually it's important in the sense that a number of other European countries were very hesitant about the Ukraine. And I think it goes back to this basic point that if Ukraine was a member of NATO, we would have been obliged to make a much more fundamental support of the Ukraine under the obligations of NATO and indeed of the EU. And therefore, my question really is directed largely to Tobias, that I'm a little concerned as to his interpretation of his, to quote him, the hesitance of the USA, in the sense that, does he think that if we had, hypothetically, an attack on any other country in the European Union or any other country in the EU, that the US would not be there in totally full support, because that would be surely their legal obligation at the moment. Do you think that is our great danger? And actually, I've been, as a former member of the European Parliament, to meetings of our former members association. We had one with the French government recently. And I've always said it's very important for countries to join NATO that are not members of NATO in the EU to get this kind of support. Finding still a bit of a split of view on that. And I'd like your comment.
Thank you, Robert. Tobias, can we just get your answer on that? And then I'm going to ask Sajid's question on China before we finish.
Yeah, I think, Sarah, I think you're probably referring to NATO rather than the EU. It is the NATO commitment, the Article 5 commitment that requires
it's also an EU one.
Nations to lead in. And quite rightly, we are seeing NATO countries in the West bolster support to our Eastern European allies. And indeed, Britain, Germany, and others are providing the necessary assistance. But ultimately, of course, that leaves Ukraine outside that particular area. I advocated a division, the NATO Rapid Reaction Corps, moving into Ukraine prior to the invasion, because part of this today is actually grabbing the space whilst you can, and before you bump into anybody else. What you don't want is that blue on red that could then allow events to trigger out of control. I put this forward back in November, and I actually at the smaller Munich security conference in some amazing hotel in the south of near Garmisch-Partenkirchen. I can't remember. David can tell me which one it was.
It's Schloss Elmau.
Quite an amazing place. If you ever need a spa, that's the place to go. Anyway. Well, digress. There were some senior American generals there, and I did ask whether we had the capability to mobilize and move forces in over a 3 or 4 day period. And they said, absolutely, if we had the political will. And you could have then taken, like a chess game, you could have moved your pieces into the no man's land and then dominated. And if you think now of the chaos, confusion, the pain, the slaughter that is taking place, not just in Ukraine, but the economic impact of the energy crisis that is now flowing across Europe, also the famine that will take place because of the wheat and the grain that will be denied in countries in Asia and so forth, and in other insecure parts of Africa as well. Maybe, just maybe, we should have done the political calculation to put forward and step forward and recognize that European security is what NATO is all about. Defending democracy is what NATO is all about. And that means not provoking a war, but preventing one by actually supporting and answering the request by President Zelensky back then to say, come and help us before it's too late. But we blinked.
Thank you, Tobias. Tobias, in your opening remarks, you covered a certain amount of the significance of this to China. David, just as we wrap up, could I ask you your view and whether it's being discussed much amongst European colleagues, the significance of this to China beyond Europe, obviously?
I would say that for 3 years now, we have a debate in the European Union, and our position how to deal with China has shifted. If I'm asked, what is the EU policy on China? I would always say it's the 3 English C's: cooperate where possible, compete where needed, and confront where necessary. China is a lot of things for us in one. China is the second most important trading partner for us in the European Union. It's a huge economic importance, especially for Germany. And if we want to address global challenges like climate change, we need China on board. So China can be a cooperation partner. On the other hand, when it's about competition, what we need is a level playing field. We need fair standards on both sides, and this is what is lacking. That's why we were hoping with the CAI, with the agreement, the investment agreement with China, that we could improve standards, but that is now in the deep freeze. But of course, we also need to confront China, because China has very, very different views than we do in the European Union, just like in the United Kingdom. And there is a growing reaction, not only in Europe, but also in the Pacific, to an increasingly assertive Chinese behavior in the region. So dealing with China will remain a high priority in the European Union, and we need to get it right. And I think that some of our member states were perhaps too naive in dealing with China, and they were also hoping that through trade, we could expect also some development for the better as regards human rights, the rule of law and democracy. All this didn't happen. One thing is very important, that we in the European Union, and I wish we could add the UK here, but we need to deal with China as a format of 27. On the one hand, +1, the EU, and China on the other hand. For far too many years, we had these formats, 10+1, 11+1, 60+1, where our Eastern and Southeastern European partners were meeting on their own with China. If there's something which impresses China, then it's European unity. We need to show unity, and we need to show strength. And when it comes to this horrible war, this war of aggression against Ukraine, China in the end will have to make up her mind. You cannot, on the one hand, be in favor and defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and on the other hand, remain neutral or silent towards an outrageous Russian aggression.
Thank you.
Final point, perhaps,
yeah,
we might need China together with others to mediate, to negotiate, to host whatever talks that this war ends and that we have a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire.
Thank you very much, David. And I think we can all hope that one of the consequences of this might be a more united Europe, i.e. including the UK in terms of other future aggressors potentially. So I'm just going to wrap up now and apologise to Anthea, John and Cherry for not being able to get to you to hear your questions, but to give enormous thanks to Tobias and David for a really interesting discussion at such an important time. It's really fascinating to hear your perspectives, your determination, Tobias, and it's great to hear you, as I say, on the media. And David, thank you very much for giving us the European, and particularly, I like learning about German politics. We're going to need to know more and more about it. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our speakers and our questioners. And it's great to be with so many people who share our views about how important it is that the Conservative Party has a strong, powerful and influential relationship with the rest of our European friends. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. Bye.